The night her husband introduced her as his ward, Cecily did not flinch. She had practiced that smile for 7 years. In front of cracked mirrors and candlelight in cold rooms that smelled of wood smoke and old paper, she had pressed her lips together until the expression felt like a second skin. Polite, distant, belonging to no one. Lord Ashford's hand rested at her back, not warmly, never warmly, just enough to remind her where she stood. Beside him, behind him, a step below the conversation. "My ward," he said, gesturing toward her as one might gesture toward a piece of furniture that happened to be in the room. "Miss Cecily." The Duke of Weston turned. And Cecily's smile did not waver, not even slightly, because she had 7 years of practice, and pride was the only thing Ashford had never managed to take from her. But her hands, hidden in the folds of her skirt, where no one thought to look, went very still, because she knew that face. She knew the particular way he held his shoulders, like a man who had learned to carry weight young and never quite forgot it. She knew the slight hesitation before he spoke, the way his eyes moved across a room not with arrogance but with attention, as though he was always looking for something he wasn't certain he'd recognize when he found it. She had spent 3 days memorizing that face, 7 years ago. In a house that no longer existed, in a life that felt like someone else's. The Duke of Weston looked at her the way a man looks at a word he cannot quite pronounce, certain he has seen it before, uncertain where. Cecily let him wonder. She had not survived this marriage by offering answers to questions that hadn't yet been asked. The dinner party at Harwick House was the kind that existed less for pleasure than for architecture. The careful arrangement of people into rooms so that alliances could be assessed, debts could be felt without being spoken, and reputations could be quietly built or quietly destroyed over the course of a single evening. Cecily had attended 17 such dinners in the past 4 years. She had learned to count the candles when a room made her feel small. 12, she noted, looking up briefly. 12 candles in the chandelier above the entrance hall, and not one of them throwing light on her. Lord Ashford had dressed her well tonight. He always did when it mattered to him. The gown was deep green silk, understated but expensive, the kind of expense that whispered rather than announced itself. He understood appearances. He had built his entire life on them. "Weston," Ashford said, extending his hand to the Duke with the particular warmth he reserved for men whose opinion could be useful to him. "I was beginning to think you'd declined." "I was delayed," the Duke said. His voice was the same, lower perhaps with age but the same. "The roads from the north were worse than expected." "You've been in the north." Managing the estate, the late Duke left certain matters unresolved. There was something careful in the way he said it. Cecily filed it away without looking at him. "Allow me," Ashford said, and turned, and the hand came to her back and she felt the familiar, practiced pressure of being presented. "My ward, Miss Cecily." She looked up. The Duke of Weston was already looking at her. For a single, suspended moment, the length of a breath, no longer, something moved across his face. Not recognition, not quite. More like the ghost of it, the shadow that recognition leaves behind when it isn't yet certain of itself. "Miss Cecily," he inclined his head. "Your Grace," she inclined hers. And that was all. Ashford was already speaking again, steering the Duke toward the other guests, toward Lord Pemberton and his son, and the 2 MPs standing near the fireplace with glasses they had been holding for too long. The moment closed over itself like water. Cecily exhaled slowly through her nose. Across the room, Lady Whitmore was watching her with the particular expression of a woman who collected other people's small disasters and kept them in glass jars. Cecily smiled at her pleasantly and moved toward the window. The dinner itself was long. It always was in houses like this. 7 courses designed not to nourish, but to extend the time during which important men could say important things to each other, while their wives and wards looked decorative, and their enemies looked for weakness. Cecily was seated near the end of the table between a young viscount who spoke exclusively about his horses and an elderly baroness who had brought her own salt. Neither of them spoke to her directly. Neither of them was expected to. She ate quietly. She watched. The Duke of Weston was seated near the head of the table, to Ashford's left, a position of some significance that Ashford would have arranged deliberately. He ate with the distracted efficiency of a man whose mind was elsewhere. Twice she saw him reach for his wine and set it back down without drinking. The third time he looked up, directly at her. Not a glance, not the casual sweep of eyes across a dinner table. A look, deliberate, brief, and then immediately withdrawn, like a hand pulled back from something unexpectedly warm. Cecily returned her attention to her plate. The Viscount beside her had moved on from horses to hounds. She nodded at appropriate intervals and thought about nothing, and let the candles blur at the edges of her vision, which was something she had taught herself to do in the early years of this marriage, when the evenings felt too long and the exits too few. After dinner, the men went one way, and the women went another, as they always did, as though the two groups required separate air to breathe. Lady Whitmore materialized at Cecily's shoulder almost immediately. "I didn't know Ashford had a ward," she said, with the light tone of someone who very much knew everything and wished to be credited for pretending otherwise. "He has mentioned it rarely," Cecily said. "How long have you been in his care?" "Some years." "And before that," Cecily looked at her pleasantly, "before that I was somewhere else." Lady Whitmore's eyes sharpened with something between admiration and irritation, and she drifted away to find someone more forthcoming. Cecily stood near the window and watched the garden go dark outside, and thought about a word she had not let herself think in a very long time. James. She pressed it flat, folded it away, put it back where it lived, in the part of her that she had walled off not with anger but with something quieter and more durable. Practicality. He was a duke now. He had responsibilities and estates and a seat in the Lords and rooms full of people whose names mattered. He had a life that had continued, as lives did, in the direction of everything she was not. And she was a ward. A word that meant she belonged to someone, and that someone was not herself. When the men rejoined the women, Cecily was standing precisely where she had been, composed, correct, unremarkable. Ashford crossed the room and took a position beside her without looking at her, which was his way of reminding her that she was being watched without the inconvenience of actually watching her. The Duke of Weston entered behind him. He did not look at her immediately. He spoke to Lord Pemberton. He accepted a cup of coffee. He listened to something the young Viscount said about a hunting party in Derbyshire and responded with the appropriate degree of polite interest. And then, when the room had resettled itself into its evening arrangements, he moved not toward her, not exactly, but near enough that when the group around Pemberton shifted, they were standing within a few feet of each other with no one directly between them. "Miss Cecily," his voice was low, careful. "Your Grace," a pause. "Forgive me," he said. "I have the strangest feeling that we have met before." Cecily looked up at him. The smile she had practiced for 7 years was perfectly in place. "Many people feel that way," she said. "I have a common sort of face." She watched him absorb this. She watched him decide whether to press it. She watched him, ultimately, choose the path that dukes chose when they were uncertain, the one that led away from risk and toward composure. "Of course," he said, "I apologize for the confusion." "Not at all," said Cecily. He moved away. She turned back toward the window and allowed herself very quietly, where no one could see it, one small, sharp breath. The house had not been meant for shelter. It was a hunting lodge. Technically, though lodge suggested something more intentional than what it actually was. 4 walls, a fireplace that drew poorly, 2 rooms divided by a door that no longer hung straight, and a roof that had made its peace with the rain sometime in the previous decade. Cecily had found it by accident. She had been walking the boundary of her father's land, what remained of it, which was less each year, when the sky had made its decision without consulting anyone on the ground. The storm came in from the west with the particular fury of something that had been building for days and was finally, gratefully, releasing itself. She had run. The lodge was the first structure she had seen. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, breathing hard, her dress already dark with rain at the shoulders, and discovered that she was not alone. The young man standing at the fireplace turned around with the expression of someone who had been caught doing something he hadn't realized required an excuse. He was perhaps 20, 21. Tall, with the kind of build that suggested he had grown quickly and hadn't quite decided what to do with the result. His coat was good. She noticed that immediately because she had grown up noticing the difference between good coats and adequate ones, and his was the former. But it was soaked through, hanging from a hook near the fire, and he was standing in his shirt sleeves with his hair pushed back from his forehead and an open book in one hand. "Oh," he said. "Oh," said Cecily. They looked at each other. Outside, the storm made itself comfortable. His name was James. He offered it without the surname first, which she thought was either very informal or very deliberate, and she would not decide which until later. "Cecily," she said in return, "are you from the village?" "The farm to the east, my father's land." He nodded as though filing this away. "I rode out from Ashworth this morning. I didn't expect—" He glanced toward the window, where the rain was doing something dramatic against the glass. "This." Ashworth, she knew the name. Everyone in the county knew the name. The Duke of Ashworth's estate was 12 miles east, large enough to have its own geography, and the Duke himself was the kind of man whose presence was felt even in rooms he wasn't occupying. She looked at James more carefully. He bore the watching with an equanimity that suggested he was used to it, but not comfortable with it. The particular stillness of someone who had learned to hold themselves steady under observation, without ever quite learning to enjoy it. "You're his son," she said. "His younger son," James said, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression, a door closing gently over a room he didn't care to show. "Which means I am decorative at formal occasions and ignored at all others. You needn't look impressed." "I wasn't going to," Cecily said. He blinked, and then unexpectedly he smiled. The storm lasted 3 days. Later, Cecily would find this implausible, would wonder if memory had exaggerated it, stretched 3 hours into 3 days the way the mind sometimes enlarged the spaces that mattered. But she had checked after, and it had been 3 days. 3 days of rain that sealed the lodge's door with mud, made the road back to her father's farm impassable, and left her with no company but a fire that smoked, a roof that leaked in one corner, and James. They managed. There were 2 blankets in a chest that smelled of cedar. There were candles enough, if used carefully. There were 4 books in a saddlebag he had brought, which became the center of an ongoing argument that began on the first afternoon and was still unresolved when the rain finally stopped. "You cannot tell me," Cecily said on the second evening, sitting cross-legged on the floor with her back against the wall and a candle balanced on her knee, "that you genuinely prefer Richardson to Fielding." "I don't prefer him," James said from the other side of the fireplace. "I said he was more honest." "About what?" "About the fact that people are mostly terrible to each other and call it virtue." Cecily considered this. "That is an extraordinarily bleak interpretation of Pamela." "It is an accurate one. It's also an interpretation that makes you sound like you've had a very unhappy dinner party recently." He looked at her. The firelight was doing something particular to the angles of his face, sharpening them, or perhaps just making them visible in a way that daylight didn't. 3 months ago, he said, my father's house, 40 people I counted. Counted what? How many of them were saying what they actually meant? She waited. 2, he said. Myself and a very drunk baronet from Shropshire who told my father's steward exactly what he thought of the claret. Cecily laughed. She hadn't meant to, it came out too quickly, too unguarded, the laugh of someone who had momentarily forgotten to be careful. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. James was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. You do that, he said. Do what? Cover your mouth when you laugh, as though you're apologizing for it. She lowered her hand. Force of habit. A habit from where? She looked at the fire. My father has very specific ideas about how young women should conduct themselves in company. And laughing isn't among them. Laughing too freely isn't among them. James was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed slightly, less careful, more direct. That sounds very lonely. It was such a simple observation, so plainly and precisely true that Cecily felt it land somewhere in the center of her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She didn't answer. He didn't press. That was the thing about James, she would think later. He knew when to stop. On the third morning, the rain slowed to something manageable. They both knew, without saying it, that this was ending. He would ride back to Ashworth. She would walk back to her father's farm. They would return to their respective lives, which did not intersect and never would. Cecily was folding the second blanket back into the chest when he said, quietly, I would like to call on you. She stilled. Properly, he said, with your father's permission, I would like, a pause, and she heard in it the same careful quality she had come to recognize over 3 days, the quality of a man choosing words not to impress but to mean. I would like to know you beyond a storm. She turned around. He was standing by the door, his coat back on, dry enough now, his saddlebag over his shoulder. He looked younger in the gray morning light than he had by firelight, more uncertain. She thought about her father's debts. She thought about the 3 men who had already come to the house with papers and polite expressions and left with pieces of land that had once belonged to her grandfather. She thought about the particular arithmetic of her life, what she was worth, what she was owed, what was still possible. Then she thought about a man who counted honest people at dinner parties and came up with 2. Yes, she said, I would like that. James smiled, not the careful, composed expression she had seen him manage in the first hours, but something else, something that reached all the way to his eyes and stayed there. Good, he said. He left. The rain stopped 20 minutes later, as though it had only been waiting for the right ending. She waited 6 months. The first month she watched the road. The second month she stopped watching and started listening for news from Ashworth, for a name dropped in conversation, for anything. By the 4th month she understood. His father had died. James was no longer the younger son. He was the Duke of Ashworth, and a duke's life did not accommodate visits to a farmer's daughter whose land was being consumed by debt. By the 5th month, Lord Ashford had come to her father with a proposal. By the 6th, she was married. The night before the wedding, Cecily sat at her window and looked at the road for the last time. Then she practiced her smile in the cracked mirror above her washstand until it felt like a second skin. The word had been Ashford's invention. Cecily had understood this on the 3rd day of their marriage, when she had attempted to write a letter to her cousin in Bath and discovered that the writing desk in her sitting room had been emptied of paper. Not misplaced, not moved. Emptied deliberately, thoroughly, in the way that only deliberate people emptied things. She had gone to Ashford. He had looked at her over the top of his correspondence, with the expression of a man who found interruptions mildly distasteful. You won't be needing to correspond independently, he said. If there is something that requires writing, I will arrange it. She is my cousin. She is a woman of no consequence in a city I have no interest in. He returned to his papers. You may speak to her if she visits. She won't visit. Cecily had stood in the doorway of his study for a long moment. Then she had gone back to her sitting room, sat down in the chair by the window, and made herself a private accounting of her situation. She was 19 years old. She had no money of her own. Her father's estate had been entirely absorbed into Ashford's holdings as part of the marriage settlement. She had no family nearby. She had no legal recourse that would not humiliate her publicly and ruin her completely. What she had was her name, and Ashford had already begun dismantling that. My ward. She had first heard him use it 6 weeks into the marriage, at a small supper with 2 of his associates. She had entered the room and he had said it so naturally, so casually, as though it were simply true, that for a moment she had looked around to see who he was talking about. Then she understood. A ward was manageable. A ward was a charitable arrangement, a mark of generosity on his part. A ward had no claims, no history, no expectations that society was obligated to honor. A wife was different. A wife implied a relationship. A wife could, theoretically, speak. Cecily had said nothing. She had smiled and inclined her head, and filed the information away in the part of herself she was rapidly developing for exactly this purpose. The part that watched and waited and did not spend what it was still accumulating. The morning after the dinner at Harwick House, she was in the garden when she heard the gate. She did not look up immediately. She was deadheading the roses along the east wall. Ashford did not employ a sufficient gardener, another small economy he maintained to remind her that comfort was his to grant or withhold. And her hands were already dirty, and she was already irritated by a particularly stubborn stem that refused to separate cleanly. Miss Cecily, she looked up. The Duke of Weston was standing at the garden gate. He was alone, which was irregular. He was in riding clothes, which suggested he had come directly and without particular planning. And he was looking at her with the expression of a man who had spent the night arguing with himself and arrived having lost. Cecily set down her shears. Your Grace, she did not move toward the gate. Lord Ashford is not at home. I know, a pause. I came to speak with you. The morning was very quiet around them. Birdsong, distant traffic, the sound of the house behind her doing its ordinary business of existing. That would be irregular, she said. Yes. Lord Ashford would not approve. No, he was not pretending otherwise. She noted this. You had better come in, then, she said, before Mrs. Holt sees you from the kitchen window and tells him anyway. They walked the length of the garden path twice before either of them said anything of substance. This was, Cecily thought, a very James thing to do, to move while thinking, to let the body manage the awkward business of existing in space while the mind caught up. She had forgotten that about him. She wished she hadn't remembered it now. I have been trying, he said at last, to place you, since last night. I have been going through every occasion, every introduction, He stopped walking. It was the lodge. Cecily kept walking. One more step, too, before she stopped as well. She said nothing. The storm, he said, 7 years ago. You had your hair differently and I couldn't. Another pause. It was you. The garden was very still. You have a good memory, Cecily said. I have thought about those 3 days more than I should probably admit. His voice was careful, but underneath the care there was something raw and unmanaged that she recognized, because she had spent 7 years managing the same thing in herself. Cecily. It was the first time anyone had said her name without a title in longer than she could immediately calculate. She turned around. He looked not as she had imagined him looking, in the occasional unguarded moments when she had allowed herself to imagine anything. He looked tired. He looked like a man carrying something he had never put down, and was only now beginning to feel the weight of. You married Ashford, he said. It was not an accusation, it was quieter than that. Yes. When? 6 months after the storm. Something moved across his face. My father died. There was the estate and the title, and I could not. He stopped. I was going to come back. I know, said Cecily. He blinked. I understood, she said, with the same precision she applied to everything that mattered. I understood why you didn't come. I was not angry. But you married him. I had very limited alternatives. She said it simply, without self-pity, because self-pity was a luxury she had never been able to afford. My father's debts were significant. Ashford's offer was the only one. I made a practical decision. You were 19. Yes. That is not. He pressed his mouth together. That is not a decision a 19-year-old should have to make practically. Many 19-year-olds do. She held his gaze. I was not unique in this. He was quiet for a moment. Then very carefully, are you unhappy? The question was so direct that it startled her. Not because it was inappropriate, but because no one had asked it. Not once in 7 years had anyone looked at her and asked the specific, simple question of whether she was unhappy. She considered lying. She considered the smile, the practiced second-skin smile that she could deploy in 3 seconds flat. She did neither. I am managing, she said, which is not the same thing, but it is also not nothing. James looked at her for a long moment. You waited, he said. It was barely above a murmur, not quite a question, not quite a statement, as though he was still deciding what he meant by it. Cecily felt something tighten in her chest. She kept her voice even. I stopped waiting, she said. There is a difference. The words landed between them like something breakable set down on stone. James absorbed them. She watched him do it, watched him take the full weight of what she meant and not flinch from it, which was the least she was owed, and also, she was finding, more than she had expected. I know, he said quietly, I know there is. From the house behind her she heard the front door open. Mrs. Holt's voice, and then another male clipped familiar. Ashford was home early. Cecily's expression rearranged itself in the span of a single breath. Not dramatically, just a closing, a settling. The garden became a garden again, and she became a ward again, and the distance between herself and the Duke of Weston became correct and measurable. You should go, she said, in a tone that was pleasant and entirely without inflection. James looked at her for one moment longer than was wise. Then he nodded once and turned toward the gate. Your Grace, she said when he was almost through it. He paused. Do not come here again without an invitation. A beat. He watches more carefully than he appears to. James looked back at her over his shoulder. So do you, he said. And then he was gone, and Cecily was examining the roses again with great attention when Ashford appeared at the garden door, and her hands were only slightly less steady than usual, which she decided to consider a victory. Ashford noticed everything. This was the thing people misunderstood about him. They saw a cold man, a contained man, a man whose emotional range appeared to run from mild satisfaction to mild displeasure, and they assumed that coldness meant inattention. They assumed that a man who felt little also observed little. They were wrong. Ashford observed everything. He simply felt nothing about most of it, which made him, in many ways, a more precise instrument than a man who cared. Caring clouded things. Caring made people look where they wanted to look rather than where they needed to. Ashford always looked where he needed to. That evening, he said nothing about the garden. He said nothing at dinner, nothing over the correspondence he reviewed afterward in his study, nothing when Cecily excused herself at 9 o'clock with the measured politeness that had become the entire texture of their domestic life. He simply watched her go, with the particular quality of attention she had learned to feel on the back of her neck like a change in air pressure. She lay awake for a long time that night. The restriction came 4 days later. Not dramatically. Ashford did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice, which Cecily had come to understand was not restraint but preference. Loud men were uncontrolled men. Ashford was never uncontrolled. He simply mentioned, over breakfast, that he had declined the Pembrokes' invitation on her behalf. Cecily set down her cup. "I was looking forward to that." "I'm sure you were." He turned a page of his newspaper. "Lady Pembroke keeps a very informal house. I don't think it suits you at the moment." A pause. "The Ashworths will be there," he added without looking up. The word sat on the table between them like a stone placed very deliberately in the center of a path. Cecily picked up her cup again. "I see." "I thought you might." He folded the newspaper. "You have been looking somewhat tired lately. A quieter week would do you good." He left the table. Cecily stared at the window and counted slowly from 1 to 10 in French, which was something she did when she needed to keep her face from doing anything her face was not supposed to do. Dix. She released a breath. So he knew or suspected. Probably suspected, she corrected herself. Ashford did not act on certainties, he acted on probabilities which he managed with the same cold efficiency he applied to his investments. He had identified a variable he didn't like and he was removing it. Nothing personal, just arithmetic. The question was how much he knew, and how he had come to know it. The answer came, as answers often did in this house, from somewhere she wasn't looking. 3 days after the breakfast conversation, Cecily was in the upstairs corridor when she heard Ashford's voice from the study below, low, precise, conducting what was clearly a private conversation with someone she couldn't immediately identify. She should have kept walking. She stopped. "Watch them in the garden for approximately 10 minutes, said a voice she recognized after a moment as Mr. Crail, Ashford's secretary. A thin, colorless man who moved through the house like a draft. "He left before you returned." "Did she initiate the meeting?" "It appeared to be his arrival, my lord. She did not seem to have anticipated it." A pause. "And the dinner?" "Nothing I could observe directly. They spoke once briefly near the end of the evening." Another pause, longer this time. "Keep watching," Ashford said. "Both of them." Cecily stood very still in the corridor above. Both of them. So it was not only her. He was watching James as well, which meant this was not simply domestic suspicion. This was something more considered, something that had a purpose beyond the merely territorial. She walked to her room with her usual measured pace and closed the door behind her and sat at the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap. Why James? Ashford was not a jealous man. She had understood this early. He had not married her for feeling, and he did not maintain their arrangement out of feeling. What he maintained it for was considerably more specific. Control, and something she had not yet fully identified, something that lived in the locked drawer of his mahogany desk and in certain conversations that stopped when she entered the room, and in the particular way he had looked at her once in the first week of their marriage, when she had mentioned her mother. Her mother, who had died when Cecily was 4. Her mother, whose name Ashford had recognized. She had seen it clearly in a flash of something that crossed his face and was immediately suppressed. She had filed it away. She was beginning to think she had been too patient. That night, she waited. Ashford took his evening brandy in the study at 9:30, reviewed papers until 11, and retired. She had mapped his habits in the first year of their marriage, not with any particular plan in mind, simply because knowing the patterns of a place made it easier to navigate quietly. At 11:15, she was in the corridor. At 11:20, she was in the study, with the door behind her and a single candle in her hand. She did not go to his desk immediately. She stood in the center of the room and looked at it, the large mahogany desk with its surface of organized papers and its 3 locked drawers, and reminded herself that she was looking for understanding, not confrontation. Information, not action. Know the territory before you move in it. Then she went to the desk. The top drawer was unlocked and contained what it always contained: correspondence, draft letters, account summaries. She had seen these before in pieces, and they told her nothing new. The second drawer was locked. She had expected this. The third drawer, the bottom one, the one she had never tried, was also locked. But the lock, she noticed, was different from the second. Older. The kind of lock that belonged to furniture that had been in a family for generations rather than purchased for a purpose. She knelt down. Behind the third drawer, fitted into the frame in a way that was invisible unless you were looking at exactly the right angle and exactly the right light, a small, flat key. Her hand was steady when she reached for it. She was mildly proud of this. The drawer opened. Inside, a bundle of letters, tied with a cord that had been white once and was now the color of old cream. Beneath the letters, a legal document folded into thirds. And beneath the document, a miniature portrait in a small oval frame. A woman Cecily did not recognize, young, dark-haired, painted with the kind of careful attention that suggested the painter had felt something about the subject. She took the letters first. They were addressed to Ashford, all of them in the same hand, a hand that was careful and slightly formal, the hand of someone who had been educated past their station or perhaps grown up between stations, uncertain which way to lean. The first letter was dated nearly 30 years ago. She unfolded it. "My dear Edmund, I write this knowing you will not answer because you never answer, and because I have finally understood that the not answering is itself an answer. But there are things that must be said regardless of whether they are received, and I find I can no longer carry this one alone. The child is yours." Cecily stopped breathing. She read it again. "The child is yours. I have told no one, I will tell no one. I am resolved to marry quietly and give the child a name that is not mine to give, and you need never acknowledge what you know, and no amount of silence will change. But I want you to know that I know. And I want you to know that she will be fine. She is already, even now, even so small, entirely herself. She does not need you, she will never need you. I thought you should know that too." The letter was signed with a single initial, M. Cecily sat on the floor of her husband's study with a letter in her hand, and felt the room rearrange itself around her. M, her mother's name, had been Margaret. She sat very still for a moment that might have been 30 seconds or 5 minutes, she couldn't have said. The candle burned steadily. The house was completely quiet. Then she heard footsteps on the stairs. Not Ashford's, his were heavier, more deliberate. These were lighter. Crail, possibly, making his last round of the house before bed. Cecily refolded the letter with hands that had decided, independently of the rest of her, to remain steady. She placed it back exactly as she had found it. She closed the drawer. She locked it. She replaced the key. She was in the corridor, moving toward the stairs, by the time the footsteps reached the lower landing. She did not look at Crail when she passed him. She went to her room and sat in the chair by the window and looked at the dark garden below and thought about a word she had been avoiding for 30 seconds or 5 minutes. Father. Not Ashford. Never Ashford. She had always known that, in the way you know things you have never been told but have simply always understood. Someone else. She thought about the legal document she hadn't had time to read. She thought about the miniature portrait. She thought about James, the Duke of Weston, whose father had known her mother, whose family had intersected with hers in a way she was only beginning to map. And then she thought about the one thing that made all of it suddenly, coldly coherent. Ashford had married her knowing. He had not married her despite the secret. He had married her because of it. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair by the window until the garden went from black to gray to the pale, unconvinced blue of early morning, and she thought with the particular clarity that comes only when exhaustion burns away everything that isn't essential. By the time the house began to stir, the kitchen sounds, the distant opening of doors, the ordinary machinery of a household that did not know it was standing on different ground than it had been the night before, Cecily had assembled what she knew into something she could hold steadily enough to examine. Her mother had written to Ashford 30 years ago. Her mother had been carrying a child that was not her husband's. Her mother had married quietly and given the child a name that was not mine to give, which meant Cecily's father, the man she had grown up calling father, had known. Or not known. Or known and chosen not to know, which was its own kind of knowing. And the man her mother had written to, Edmund Ashford, who had never answered, had waited 30 years, and then had come to her father's failing farm with a proposal, and had married the daughter he had known about and never claimed. Why? This was the question that had kept her awake. Not the fact of it. She had long suspected there was a reason for this marriage that had nothing to do with her, because nothing in Ashford's life had ever had anything to do with feelings he did not find useful. But why her, specifically, now like this? The legal document. She hadn't had time to read it. She needed to read it. The opportunity came on the 4th day. Ashford left for his club at 10 in the morning, which he did every Thursday with the reliability of a man who found comfort in predictability. Crail accompanied him. The housemaid had her half-day. Mrs. Holt was managing a delivery in the kitchen that would keep her occupied for at least an hour. Cecily was in the study in under 3 minutes. The document was where she had left it, beneath the letters, folded into thirds, slightly yellowed at the edges. She unfolded it at the desk, in the good light from the window, and read it straight through once without stopping. Then she sat down in Ashford's chair and read it again, more slowly, with the attention it deserved. It was a marriage settlement. Not hers, older than that, the paper and ink both placing it at least 25 years back. Between her mother and the man Cecily had grown up calling her father. A standard document in most respects, the usual provisions, the usual language of property and obligation, except for the final clause. It was written in a different hand from the rest, added later, she thought, by a different solicitor, or perhaps by someone who was not a solicitor at all. The handwriting was precise and cold, and she recognized it as Ashford's. She read it 3 times. The clause stated, in the careful, strangling language of legal documents, that in the event of the death of both parties to the marriage, meaning her mother and the man she had called father, any surviving children of the union would fall under the guardianship of Edmund Ashford, and that any property, inheritance, or claim to title that might attach to said children through bloodline, whether currently known or subsequently established, would be administered by Ashford on their behalf until such time as he saw fit to release it, until such time as he saw fit. There was no age specified, no condition, no limit. Cecily set the document down on the desk. She looked at the window for a moment. Then she looked back at the document, any claim to title that might attach through bloodline. She thought about the letters. She thought about her mother's careful, slightly formal handwriting. She thought about the initial M and the words, "She will be fine. She is already entirely herself." And then she thought about something she had not yet allowed herself to think about directly. If Ashford was not her father, and her mother had written to him, and her mother had moved in a world that intersected with the Weston family. She needed to think about this carefully. She needed to think about it without the part of her that wanted very badly for the answer to be something other than what it appeared to be. She folded the document, replaced it, locked the drawer, replaced the key. Then she went to her sitting room and wrote a letter. She addressed it to her mother's sister, her Aunt Philippa, who lived in Derbyshire and whom she had not seen since the wedding, and who had looked at her, at the wedding, with an expression that Cecily had catalogued at the time as pity, and was now reclassifying as something else entirely. She did not write what she knew. She wrote only what she needed confirmed. Dear Aunt Philippa, I find myself thinking lately of my mother, of her life before her marriage, her friendships, her connections. I realize I know very little of this period. I wonder if you might be willing to tell me something of it when the opportunity allows. I ask in particular about any connections she may have had to families in this county, Any names you remember her mentioning? Any arrangements that may have been discussed in those years that you felt were perhaps not entirely as they appeared? I trust your discretion absolutely. She sealed it herself and paid the boy from the Mews directly, which cost her the last of the small amount of pin money she had managed to accumulate over 3 months. It was worth it. The reply came in 11 days. Philippa wrote in the cramped, urgent hand of a woman who had been waiting a long time to say something, and was not entirely certain she should be saying it now, but had decided, finally, that the cost of continued silence was higher than the cost of speaking. Cecily sat in her chair by the window and read it in the gray afternoon light. Her mother, Philippa wrote, had been a great beauty. This was not vanity. It was simply true, and it had been, in the world they moved in at that time, both an asset and a complication. She had attracted attention that she did not always know how to manage, from men who did not always deserve her attention in return. Among those men, Philippa wrote, and Cecily could feel the hesitation across 11 days and 50 miles of distance, had been a gentleman connected to the Weston family. Not the Duke himself. The Duke at that time had been elderly and married and not the relevant party, but his younger brother, a man named Weston, Arthur Weston, who had been charming and persuasive and had made promises that he had not ultimately kept. Cecily's grip on the letter tightened slightly. Arthur Weston, James's uncle. She read on. Her mother, Philippa wrote carefully, had found herself in a situation of some difficulty. She had written to Ashford, who was at that time a young man with aspirations and a talent for managing other people's complications, asking for his help. She had trusted him, Philippa wrote, which in retrospect had been her most significant error. Ashford had helped. He had arranged the marriage to Cecily's father, a decent man, a quiet man, a man who had agreed to the arrangement in exchange for the settlement of certain debts. He had drawn up the papers himself. And somewhere in those papers, Philippa wrote, there had been a clause. She had never seen it. She had only heard, years later, from a solicitor who had been troubled by it, and had perhaps said more than he should have over a glass of wine at a county assembly. A clause, Philippa wrote, relating to the child, to what the child might one day be worth if certain things became known, if certain connections were established. Edmund Ashford, she wrote, was never a man who helped without securing his return. The letter ended with an apology, for not having said this sooner, for having hoped it would not matter, for having watched Cecily walk into that marriage and stayed silent, because Philippa had not been certain, had not had proof, had not wanted to destroy a niece's chance at security on the basis of an old solicitor's indiscreet remark at a county dance. Cecily folded the letter. She sat with it in her lap and looked at the gray sky over the garden. Arthur Weston had been James's uncle, which meant that Cecily's claim, if it could be established, if the bloodline could be proven, was a claim on the Weston family, not to the dukedom. That was not the point. The point was property. The point was a specific piece of property that Arthur Weston had held independently of the main estate, land that had passed into dispute after his death, and that had been in legal uncertainty for, she calculated, almost exactly the length of her life. Ashford had known about the land. He had known about the claim. He had found the woman who carried it, and he had married her daughter, and he had written himself into the documents as administrator of anything that might ever attach to that daughter through bloodline. He had been waiting. For what exactly? For the legal dispute to resolve in a direction that made the claim valuable, for an opportunity to present it or suppress it at a moment of maximum advantage. She didn't know yet, but she knew this. James needed to know. The problem was getting to him. Ashford had effectively sealed her social calendar. The Pembrokes had been declined. 2 subsequent invitations had been similarly managed. She was not imprisoned. She could walk in the garden. She could visit the lending library on Thursday mornings with Mrs. Holt in attendance. But she was contained, which was a different kind of the same thing. It was, in the end, James who found the way. A note arrived, tucked inside a volume of Fielding that she had not requested from the lending library, but that appeared in the stack Mrs. Holt carried in one Thursday morning, placed there by someone who had spoken to the librarian, who had spoken to Mrs. Holt, who, Cecily rather suspected, had her own private opinions about Lord Ashford that she had never been given an appropriate occasion to express. The note was brief. The Alderton Gallery, Tuesday, 11 o'clock. It is a public space and I have asked Lady Pemberton to attend, so you will not be without a chaperone. I know more than I did. I believe you do as well. Come if you can. W. Cecily read it twice. Then she held it over the candle on her desk and watched it go. Tuesday was 4 days away. She spent those 4 days being, as far as Ashford could observe, entirely unremarkable. She was present at meals. She was pleasant at the one small supper he arranged on Monday evening. She expressed no interest in galleries or Tuesdays or anything that might register as a variable requiring management. Tuesday morning she dressed quietly, told Mrs. Holt she was going to the lending library, and went to the Alderton Gallery instead. James was already there when she arrived. He was standing in front of a large landscape painting with his hands behind his back, which was, she thought, the posture of a man who was trying very hard to look like he was thinking about the painting. Lady Pemberton was at the far end of the room, examining a portrait with the focused attention of a woman who understood exactly what was required of her and was grateful for something genuinely interesting to look at in the meantime. Cecily stopped beside James. They both looked at the landscape. "You found something," she said quietly without preamble. "My father's solicitor," James said, equally quiet. "He died last year and his son took over the practice. The son is considerably less discreet." A pause. He mentioned a document, a clause in a settlement he had been asked to witness 25 years ago. He remembered it because it had troubled him at the time and he had never entirely resolved the feeling. Cecily looked at a painted hill in the middle distance. "Arthur Weston," she said. James was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said. "I know most of it." She kept her voice level. "My aunt wrote to me, your uncle and my mother." "Yes." "And the land that has been in dispute." "It would resolve to you," James said, "if the connection were established legally. Arthur died without legitimate heirs. The land has been held in trust for 20 years while the courts argued about it. If you could prove—" "Ashford has the proof," she said it simply. "He has had it for years, he has been holding it." Another silence. "For what purpose?" James said. "I don't know yet." She moved slightly to the left, as though examining a different element of the painting. "But I know it isn't charitable." James turned his head and looked at her directly, which was not, technically, the behavior of a man simply standing next to an acquaintance in a public gallery. Cecily did not look back. She kept her eyes on the painting. "Cecily," his voice was very low, "whatever he has been holding, it is yours. The land, the claim, the proof. It belongs to you." "I am aware." "Then—" "I cannot simply take it." She said it without frustration because frustration was a luxury and she had learned to spend her luxuries carefully. "I have no legal standing to act independently. I have no solicitor he hasn't already spoken to. I have no—" She stopped, recalibrated. "I cannot move without him knowing I have moved. He watches everything." James was quiet. "So do I," Cecily said, with a precision that was also, if one listened for it, something very slightly else. "And I have been watching for considerably longer." From the far end of the gallery, Lady Pemberton announced that she thought the portrait of the third Earl was really remarkably well executed, and would they come and look? Cecily moved toward the portrait with the unhurried pace of a woman who had nowhere in particular to be. James fell into step beside her, a correct and unremarkable distance away. "What do you need?" he asked almost inaudibly. She thought about the document in the locked drawer. She thought about her aunt's letter, already ash in the fireplace. She thought about Ashford at his breakfast table with his newspaper and his mild, watchful eyes, managing variables with the cold efficiency of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice. "A solicitor he hasn't spoken to," she said, "and a little more time." The invitation to Lord Harwick's autumn dinner came on a Wednesday. Ashford accepted it. Cecily noted this with interest. He had been declining invitations for weeks, managing her exposure, as she had come to think of it, with the same quiet efficiency he applied to everything else. The fact that he had accepted this one meant he wanted something from it. An audience, perhaps. A particular arrangement of people in a room. She spent the 4 days between the acceptance and the dinner being completely, deliberately ordinary. She was pleasant at meals. She asked no questions. She expressed mild interest in the weather, in a novel she was not actually reading, in a piece of embroidery she had not touched in 3 weeks. She was, as far as Ashford could observe, entirely untroubled. She was, in fact, the most troubled she had been in 7 years, because James had found her a solicitor. The message had come through the lending library again. Mrs. Holt was becoming, Cecily thought, either an unwitting participant in something she didn't understand or a very discreet one in something she understood completely. A Mr. Graves, the note said, 40 years in practice, currently retired. Previously employed by the Weston family for 15 years before a disagreement with James's father had ended the arrangement, which meant, critically, that he was a man who knew the family's legal history in detail and had reasons of his own to be forthcoming about it. He was also, James had ascertained, a man Ashford had never dealt with directly. Cecily had written to him. His reply had arrived that morning, tucked inside a copy of Persuasion that she had not requested, and she had read it in her sitting room with the door locked, and then placed it inside the novel's back cover, and put the novel on her shelf between 2 others. Mr. Graves had confirmed everything. The land was hers. The bloodline could be established through the letters alone, her mother's letters which Ashford had but which were, legally speaking, her mother's correspondence and not his property to retain. The clause in the settlement was, Mr. Graves wrote in the careful language of a man choosing his words with forensic precision, almost certainly unenforceable. It had been written to appear binding. It was not. Lord Ashford, Mr. Graves wrote, has been in possession of documents that do not belong to him, exercising administrative authority over an estate that was never legitimately his to administer, and has done so for the entirety of your marriage, which, if certain questions were raised in the right setting, before the right people, would constitute a matter of considerable legal and social consequence. Cecily had read that sentence 4 times. Then she had closed the book and gone down to lunch, and eaten a reasonable amount of a reasonable meal and said nothing at all. Lord Harwick's house was full. 40 people at least, the kind of dinner that announced itself as significant through sheer accumulation of important names in a single room. Cecily had dressed carefully. Not dramatically, she was not attempting theater. She wore the dark green silk again which Ashford had chosen and paid for, and which she thought he might recognize as a small private irony if he were the kind of man who noticed small private ironies. He was not. This was one of his limitations. James was there. She had known he would be. She had seen his name on the guest list when Ashford had left it on the hall table, which he sometimes did, and which she had always treated as invisible, and which she suspected he had begun to leave there deliberately, as a kind of territorial marking. She did not look at James when she entered. He did not look at her. They had, without discussing it, developed a fluency in not looking at each other that was, she thought, considerably more intimate than looking would have been. The dinner itself proceeded in the usual manner. 7 courses. The usual arrangement of important men and their wives and their wards and their associates, all performing the intricate social choreography of people who needed things from each other and were too well bred to say so directly. Cecily was seated near the middle of the table this time, a small adjustment from the previous dinner, she noted, and not an accidental one. Ashford had requested the placement, she suspected, close enough to observe, far enough from James to make conversation impossible. She ate, she listened, she watched. Ashford was in fine form. He was the version of himself he deployed at important dinners, warmer than usual, more expansive, the kind of man who seemed, to people who didn't know him well, like someone worth knowing. He told a story about a property dispute in the north that made the men around him laugh. He deferred gracefully to Lord Harwick on a question of politics. He was, for approximately 2 hours, entirely convincing as a reasonable human being. Cecily watched him be convincing and thought about the locked drawer, and the letters that were not his, and the clause that was not enforceable, and the 30 years he had spent assembling a situation that had always been designed to benefit no one but himself. After dinner, the groups reformed in the drawing room in the usual way. She was standing near the fireplace, speaking with Lady Harwick about nothing in particular, when she heard Ashford's voice lift slightly, not raised, never raised but carrying, in the way that voices carry when they intend to. "Hasn't really the head for it, I'm afraid," he was saying to Lord Pemberton and 2 men she didn't know, a pleasant, regretful tone. "One tries to include her, of course, but—" He gestured slightly in her direction. Lady Harwick stopped speaking mid-sentence. The room did not go entirely silent. It went thinner, the specific quality of quiet that falls when people are listening without appearing to listen. "She has no opinion worth hearing," Ashford said, with the light finality of someone concluding a statement rather than making one. "On these matters, on most matters in honesty, it is simply the way of it." Lord Pemberton made a sound of vague agreement. The 2 men nodded. Lady Harwick beside Cecily had gone very still. Cecily looked at the fire. She was aware of James across the room. She did not look at him. She felt him, in the way she had come to feel the things that mattered, not as a specific sensation but as a change in the quality of the air around her. A presence that altered the atmosphere of a room by being in it. She heard him begin to move. She turned. He was 3 steps away from Ashford, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it in company. Not angry exactly, but resolved in a way that was its own kind of dangerous. The kind of resolve that had stopped practicing restraint. Cecily looked at him. He met her eyes. She shook her head, the smallest possible movement, barely a movement at all. A breath made visible. He stopped. The room was still doing its thin, attentive thing around them. Cecily set down her glass. She walked with her usual measured pace across the room, not toward Ashford, toward the center of it, the point from which she could be seen and heard most clearly by the largest number of people present. She stopped. "Lord Pemberton," she said, in a voice that was pleasant and entirely audible, "you were involved, I believe, in the Hartley estate dispute some years ago." Pemberton blinked at the apparent non sequitur. "Yes, peripherally." "Then you may be familiar with the question of bloodline claims in property settlements. Specifically, the enforceability of clauses added after the original document has been witnessed." A pause. Pemberton looked uncertain. "It is a somewhat technical area." "It is," Cecily agreed. "The relevant point, I understand, is that such clauses are generally not enforceable without the explicit consent of the party they concern, particularly when that party was a minor at the time of the original settlement and had no legal representation of their own." The room had gone fully quiet now. Ashford had not moved. She could see him in her peripheral vision, standing very still, in the way that very still people stand when they are deciding whether a situation is recoverable. She turned and looked at him directly. "My lord," she said, "you have in your possession a number of documents that I believe belong to me, letters from my mother, a settlement with an addendum that was never legitimate, and the legal record of a property claim that has been held in your name for 26 years without my knowledge or consent." The fire crackled. No one in the room made a sound. Ashford looked at her with the expression of a man recalculating, rapidly, precisely, with the cold efficiency that was his most genuine quality, and finding, for the first time in their acquaintance, that the numbers were not coming out in his favor. "Cecily," he said, in the quiet, warning tone of a man who expected that tone to work. "I would like them returned," she said, "all of them, through a solicitor of my choosing." A pause. "Mr. Graves, specifically, I believe you haven't met him." Something moved across Ashford's face that she had never seen there before. It was not anger. It was not the mild displeasure she had catalogued over 7 years of breakfasts and dinners, and the cold architecture of their domestic life. It was the particular expression of a man who had built something very carefully over a very long time and was watching it come apart in a room full of people he had wanted to impress. He said nothing. He had, finally, run out of the kind of nothing that worked. Lady Pemberton, from somewhere to Cecily's left, said quietly, "Good Lord." Lord Harwick cleared his throat. And Lord Pemberton, who had, in fairness, the instincts of a man who had survived 40 years of drawing-room politics, straightened slightly and said, in a voice that carried its own kind of weight, "Graves, you said. Solid man. I've used him myself. It was a small thing. It was also, in the specific economy of a room like this, in a world like this, everything." Ashford looked at Pemberton. He looked at Harwick. He looked at the two men beside him, who had taken a subtle, collective half-step back in the manner of people removing themselves from a structure they could see was no longer sound. Then he looked at Cecily. She met his eyes steadily. She had practiced this smile for 7 years. She wasn't using it now. What she was wearing instead was considerably simpler and considerably more difficult to manage, the expression of a woman who had finished being afraid and hadn't yet decided what to feel in its place. She thought distantly that she would have to figure that out, but not tonight. Tonight was enough. James found her afterward, not immediately, not dramatically, because neither of them were dramatic people, which was one of the things she had known about him from the second day in the lodge when he had simply handed her a blanket without comment and gone back to his book. He came to stand beside her near the window, a correct and unremarkable distance away, and they both looked at the dark garden beyond the glass. "You stopped me," he said quietly. "You were going to make it about you," she said. "It needed to be about me." A pause. "Yes," he said, "you're right." Outside, the first leaves of autumn were coming down in the wind, slowly, without urgency, as though they had all the time they needed. "What happens now?" James said. Cecily looked at the garden. "Mr. Graves files the relevant documents on Monday," she said. "The settlement clause will be challenged and will not survive the challenge. The letters will be recovered. The land will take longer. These things always take longer, but it will resolve correctly." "And Ashford," she considered. "He will be ruined," she said, not with satisfaction, not with regret, with the same precision she applied to everything. "Socially, legally, financially. He built his position on a foundation he didn't own. When the foundation is removed, she didn't finish. She didn't need to." James was quiet for a moment. "And you," he said, "what do you want, Cecily? Not the land, not the settlement, you." The question landed, as it always did when he asked the simple ones, somewhere in the center of her chest. She looked at the falling leaves. She thought about a 3-day storm and 2 blankets, and a man who had counted honest people at dinner parties and come up with 2. She thought about 7 years of a practiced smile and small economies, and the careful, durable work of surviving a life she hadn't chosen. She thought about what it might feel like to choose. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. James nodded, as though this was a reasonable answer, as though he had time. "I'll be here," he said, "when you do." She did not look at him. She looked at the garden, at the leaves coming down in the autumn wind, at the dark and the cold, and the particular quality of a night that felt, for the first time in a very long time, like it might be followed by a morning she actually wanted to arrive. "I know," she said. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Cecily's life. Not the hardest. The hardest had been the first year of her marriage, when she had still been in the process of understanding what she had walked into and had not yet developed the internal architecture to manage it. Not the loneliest. The loneliest had been the fourth year, when she had finally, completely, stopped listening for footsteps on the road outside. These weeks were strange because they were the first she had ever spent in the specific condition of waiting for something she had chosen to wait for. Mr. Graves filed the documents on Monday, as promised. By Wednesday, Ashford had engaged his own solicitor, a faster response than she had expected, which told her that he had anticipated some version of this, even if not this exact version, and had prepared accordingly. This did not surprise her. Ashford was not a man who was ever entirely unprepared. What he had not prepared for, she suspected, was the room full of witnesses. Lord Pemberton had, by Thursday morning, mentioned the evening at Harwick House to at least 3 people, which she knew because Lady Harwick had called, unexpectedly, pleasantly, with no stated purpose, and had mentioned it with the particular casualness of a woman conveying information she thought Cecily should have. Lord Harwick himself had written a brief note to Mr. Graves confirming his willingness to attest to the conversation if required. The legal dispute would take months, possibly longer. But the social architecture of it had resolved in an evening, in the way that social architecture sometimes did when the right people were in the right room, and someone finally said the true thing out loud. Ashford left the house on the Friday. He came to her sitting room first. She was at the window, she was always at the window now, she thought, as though she had spent 7 years looking out of it and was only now beginning to understand why, and she heard his knock and said come in with the steadiness that had become. She was realizing, not a performance but simply herself. He stood in the doorway. She turned and looked at him. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man without a calculation running. Like a man who had run out of calculations and was standing in the space where they used to be, and finding it unexpectedly cold. "You were more formidable than I anticipated," he said. It was, from him, something very close to a compliment. "You underestimated me," she said. "Most people do." A pause. "Your mother did that as well," he said. It was the first time he had mentioned her mother voluntarily. His voice had something in it that she couldn't immediately classify, not regret, exactly. Something older than regret. Something that had been there a long time and had never been given a useful name. "I know," Cecily said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded once with the finality of a man closing a ledger. He left. She heard the front door, and then the sound of the carriage, and then nothing at all. She stood at the window for a long time after that, looking at the street, thinking about a man who had made a 30-year project of securing what he wanted and had ended up with nothing, which was a kind of arithmetic that even she found bleak. Then she went downstairs and told Mrs. Holt she would take her tea in the garden. The days arranged themselves differently after that. She had the house, for the moment, until the legal proceedings resolved themselves into their final shape, which Mr. Graves assured her would favor her. She had her own correspondence, written at her own desk on paper she had purchased herself. She had mornings that belonged to her and evenings that belonged to her, and the specific, disorienting freedom of a life that had stopped being managed by someone else. She didn't know what to do with it immediately. This, she suspected, was normal. 7 years was a long time to spend in a particular kind of constraint, and freedom, real freedom, the kind that didn't have a ceiling, required some adjustment. Required learning, again, how to want things without immediately calculating whether wanting them was practical. She started small. She went to the lending library on a Tuesday instead of a Thursday. She ordered the novel she had actually wanted rather than the one she'd thought was less likely to attract comment. She took a different route home and stopped at a bakery she'd been passing for 4 years without entering and bought a small cake for no reason. She ate it standing up in the kitchen, which made Mrs. Holt pretend very thoroughly to be doing something on the other side of the room. It was, Cecily thought, an excellent cake. James called on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after Harwick House. Properly this time, a card sent in advance, a reasonable hour, the front door rather than the garden gate. She received him in the sitting room, which was sunlit and slightly cold because she had opened the window that morning and hadn't got around to closing it. He sat across from her in the armchair that Ashford had always occupied, which had previously seemed to belong to the room in some specific and permanent way, and now seemed simply like a chair. He looked better than he had at Harwick House, less tired, more himself, she thought, the way he had looked in the lodge when there had been no occasion to manage and no performance required, and he had just been a person in a room with a book and an argument about Richardson. They talked for an hour. About the legal proceedings, Mr. Graves was cautiously optimistic, James said, and the land dispute was moving faster than expected, because the existing trustee had, it turned out, been waiting for exactly this kind of resolution for years. About Ashford, who had retired to a property in the north and was, by all accounts, conducting himself with the same cold efficiency in diminished circumstances that he had managed in prosperous ones, which Cecily found she could almost respect. About London and the season and the 18 things Lady Pemberton wanted to invite her to, which had apparently become a measure of something in certain drawing rooms. About nothing in particular for stretches. It was, she thought, the most comfortable hour she had spent in longer than she could accurately calculate. When he stood to leave, he stood with the slight hesitation she recognized, the quality of a man who had something to say and was deciding, again, whether to say it. She waited. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his coat and produced a letter. She recognized it immediately. Not the letter itself, she had never seen it before, but the envelope, the age of it, the way it had been sealed and never opened, the wax still intact, still bearing the impression of a signet ring she recognized from a chain her mother had kept in a small box on her dressing table and which Cecily had carried in her own pocket on the day of her wedding because she hadn't known what else to do with it. The letter was addressed to her, in her mother's handwriting. "Where?" she said and stopped. "Ashford had it," James said quietly, "with the other letters. Mr. Graves recovered it with the documents." A pause. "It appears to have been written shortly before your mother died, and never sent." Cecily looked at the letter in his hand. The seal was intact. Her mother had closed it and addressed it, and it had never arrived, had sat in a locked drawer for 26 years while Cecily had grown up without the woman who had written it. "My father knew about it," James said. He meant his own father, the late Duke. His voice was careful, carrying the weight of something he had been living with for a few weeks. "He had correspondence with Arthur, with my uncle. He knew about the arrangement. He knew about you." Another pause. "He kept it from me. I don't know entirely why. I think he thought it was contained, that Ashford had it managed." Cecily heard what he wasn't saying. His father had known, had chosen silence, had called James home from a storm and away from a farmer's daughter, and had said nothing about why. "James," she said. He looked at her. "That is not yours to carry," she said. "He absorbed this." "I know," he said. "I'm working on that." She held out her hand for the letter. He placed it in her palm carefully, as though it were something fragile, which it was. 26 years was long enough for anything to become fragile. She held it. She did not open it immediately. She looked at her name in her mother's handwriting and felt the weight of it and let herself feel it, which was something she was also working on, the letting herself feel things without immediately converting them into practical information. It took a while. James waited. He was good at waiting. She had forgotten this about him, in the years when she had stopped allowing herself to remember things about him. He had the patience of a man who had decided that certain things were worth the time they required. When she looked up, he was watching her with the expression she had first seen by firelight in a lodge that smelled of cedar and old rain. The expression she had named eventually, over 3 days of storms and arguments about Richardson, as simply attention. The specific, undivided quality of a man who was looking at the thing he was actually looking at. She had not been looked at like that in 7 years. She thought about what he had said at Harwick House. "I'll be here when you do." She thought about what she had said in return. "I know." She thought about a practiced smile and small economies, and the long, careful work of a life lived in the margins of someone else's arrangement. She thought about 3 days and 2 blankets, and the particular quality of a morning that felt like it might be worth arriving. She thought about what it would mean to choose, not from limited alternatives, not from the arithmetic of survival, but simply because she wanted to. Because she had looked at the available world and identified the part of it that felt like home. "I stopped waiting," she said. "7 years ago I meant that." James was very still. "I know," he said quietly. "I am not the same person who waited." "I know that too." "And you are not," she stopped, recalibrated. 7 years changes things. "Yes," he said, "it does." A pause. "It doesn't change everything," he said. She looked at him. He looked back, steady, patient, with the expression of a man who had stopped practicing composure and was simply being honest, which was, she had always thought, considerably more difficult. "No," she said after a moment, "not everything." The window was still open. The autumn air came in, cool and faintly sharp, carrying the smell of leaves and the distant sound of the city going about its ordinary business. Cecily looked down at the letter in her hand. Her mother had written her name on the envelope in a hand that was careful and slightly formal, and entirely her own. "She thought she will be fine. She is already entirely herself. She does not need you." She thought she was right. She looked up at James. "Give me time," she said. It was not a no. He heard that. She could see him hear it, the particular way his shoulders settled, the breath he took, the slight easing of something that had been held carefully in place for a long time. "As much as you need," he said. He left. She sat in the sunlit sitting room with her mother's letter in her hands and the autumn coming through the open window, and she let herself be, very quietly, exactly where she was. It was enough, she thought. For now, it was more than enough. The lodge had been repaired. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't mentioned it, hadn't thought about it with any practical intention. But James had apparently arranged it sometime in the spring, quietly, the way he arranged things he cared about, which was without announcement and without requiring anyone to be grateful. She had found out when she walked there one afternoon in late June and discovered that the door hung straight. She had stood in front of it for a long moment. Then she had pushed it open. The fireplace drew properly now. The roof was sound. The 2 rooms were clean and smelled of new timber, and something faintly floral that she suspected was the result of whoever had scrubbed the floors having strong opinions about cleanliness. The chest in the corner was the same chest, old, cedar-scented, but someone had replaced the latch. She had sat on the floor in the same spot she had sat 7 years ago, with her back against the same wall, and looked at the same proportions of the same room, and thought about the distance between who she had been then and who she was now, which was considerable, and also somehow not. She was still entirely herself. Her mother had known that before she had. The land had resolved in April. Mr. Graves had written to her with the particular restrained satisfaction of a man who had been right about something for a long time, and was too professional to say "I told you so," but was also not entirely above implying it. The property was hers, formally, legally, in the precise and binding language of documents that could not be rewritten or locked in someone else's drawer. It was not a vast estate. It was farmland mostly, with a small house in indifferent repair, and a tenant who had been managing it conscientiously for 20 years under the trust, and who had written to her, after the resolution, a letter of such plain and careful dignity that she had read it 3 times and then written back immediately, which was not something she did with most correspondents. She had visited in May. The house needed work. The land was in better shape than the house. The tenant, a Mr. and Mrs. Ferris, older, practical, with 4 adult children spread across the county, had received her with a warmth that she had not entirely expected and which had required her, unexpectedly, to spend a few minutes in the Ferrises' garden on the pretense of admiring their kitchen plot while she collected herself. She was getting better at collecting herself more quickly. She was also getting better at not always needing to. Ashford had not contested the final settlement. This had surprised her slightly. She had expected more from him, one more calculation, one more attempt to recover something from the wreckage. But he had signed the documents and retired to his northern property and had, as far as she could determine, simply continued. Cold and contained and efficient in diminished circumstances, as James had reported. She thought about him sometimes, not often, and not with the consuming quality that bitterness required, which she had decided early was a cost she wasn't willing to pay. She thought about him the way she thought about the cracked mirror and the 4 walls and the long winter evenings of the first year, as part of the territory she had moved through, which had shaped her without defining her. She thought about her mother more. She had read the letter on the evening James left, sitting in the sitting room with the autumn coming through the open window. It had taken her a long time to break the seal, and longer still to read it, because she had kept stopping and looking at the ceiling and breathing in the particular way she had learned to breathe when she needed to stay steady. Her mother had written about love not romantically, not with the operatic quality that the word sometimes attracted, but practically. Practically and honestly, in the careful, slightly formal hand of a woman who had been educated past her station and had spent her life navigating the gap between what she knew and what was available to her. I have not made the life I would have chosen, her mother had written, but I have made a life that is mine in the ways that matter. And you are entirely mine. Whatever comes, whatever is decided above your head and around you and without your knowledge, as things are decided for women, you are yours first. Remember that. It is the only instruction I have that I am certain of. Be entirely yourself. It is enough. It is, in fact, everything. Cecily had sat with the letter until the candle burned low. Then she had folded it and put it in the small cedar box that had been her mother's, next to the chain with the signet seal, and placed the box on her dressing table where she could see it. She moved to the estate in September. Not because she had to. The house in London was hers to keep, legally, and several people had told her several sensible things about the advantages of maintaining a presence in the city. She moved because she wanted to, which was still, a year later, a reason that required some getting used to. The house on the estate had been repaired over the summer. She had managed the work herself, which had been both more complicated and more satisfying than she had anticipated. The tenant's wife, Mrs. Ferris, had opinions about kitchens that Cecily had found herself largely agreeing with. The result was a house that was modest and slightly uneven in places and smelled of new paint and old wood, and was, she thought, the most genuinely comfortable space she had ever occupied. She had her own writing desk. She had her own paper. She had on the desk the letter from her mother and the novel with the bent spine, Fielding, not Richardson, which she thought her mother would have found funny, and a small landscape sketch she had done herself of the view from the east window, which was not technically accomplished, but which she had made because she wanted to and had put on the wall because she liked it, and these were still new enough kinds of reasons that she noticed them. James came on a Saturday morning in late October. He had been before twice in September, once in early October, always properly announced, always the front door, always the correct duration. He had helped her argue with a contractor about the west wall and had eaten Mrs. Ferris's pie with the sincere appreciation of a man who had been eating formal dinners his whole life, and found an unadorned kitchen table unexpectedly restorative. He had not pressed. She had known he wouldn't. This was one of the things she had always known about him, even in the years when she had not been allowing herself to know things about him. He had the patience of a man who had decided that certain things were worth whatever time they required and had made his peace with the waiting. She had been making her own peace with something different, with wanting. With the specific, still unfamiliar experience of looking at the available world and identifying the part of it that felt like home and allowing herself to move toward it, not from limited alternatives, not from the arithmetic of survival, but simply because she chose it. It had taken her most of the year. She thought she was ready. He arrived at 10 in the morning, which was when she had asked him to arrive, and she met him at the door herself because she had told Mrs. Ferris she wouldn't need her until afternoon. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Walk with me," she said. They went to the lodge. It was a 20-minute walk across the boundary of the property, through the field that had gone gold with the late season, and past the old oak that the Ferrises called the marker tree, and up the slight rise to the place where the lodge sat in its clearing with its straight door and its sound roof. They walked the way they had walked at the Alderton Gallery, side by side, without touching, in the comfortable quiet of people who had learned each other's pace. She pushed the door open, the fireplace, the 2 rooms, the cedar chest. James stood in the doorway and looked at it with an expression she didn't try to name. "You had it repaired," she said. "I thought," he stopped. "I wasn't certain if that was presumptuous." "It was," she said. "I didn't mind." He looked at her. She was standing in the center of the room, in the place she had stood 7 years ago when she had pushed open a door in a storm and found she was not alone. The light was different, autumn rather than summer, coming through a window that was now clean, and she was different, considerably, in every way that mattered except the one her mother had identified. She was still entirely herself. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what you said at Harwick House, before the Pembrokes and the gallery and all of it." A pause. "You said you would be here." "Yes." "You have been." "Yes." She looked at him, at the particular way he held his shoulders, which she had memorized in 3 days and never entirely forgotten, at the slight hesitation before he spoke, the way his eyes moved across a room across her with attention rather than arrogance. "I stopped waiting 7 years ago," she said. "I meant that." "I know." "I am not starting again." She held his gaze steadily. "Waiting is not something I am willing to do anymore, for anything or anyone." James was very still. "What I am willing to do," she said, with the precision she applied to everything that mattered, "is choose. Clearly, deliberately, with full knowledge of what I am choosing and why." A pause. "I have spent a year learning what that feels like. It feels," she considered, "it feels entirely different from anything I have done before." "And," he said, his voice was quiet, careful. Underneath the care, the same thing she had heard there before, raw and unmanaged and entirely honest. "And," she said, "I choose this. I choose." The word was simple. She had been practicing it for approximately 3 months in the privacy of her own head, and it was still slightly terrifying to say aloud. "You." The lodge was very quiet around them. James crossed the room in 3 steps and took her hands in both of his, which were warm and slightly rough and entirely real, and looked at her the way he had looked at her by firelight in this same room 7 years ago, when he had said, "I would like to know you beyond a storm." "Cecily," he said. "Don't make a speech," she said. "You'll ruin it." He laughed, startled, genuine, the laugh of a man who had forgotten he was capable of being surprised by joy. She felt it land in the center of her chest and stay there. "No speech," he said. "Good." He still made the tea too strong. She discovered this on a Sunday morning 6 months later, in the kitchen of the estate house, while the spring came through the open window, and the Ferrises' dog barked at something in the field, and the cedar box sat on the shelf above the fireplace next to the Fielding novel with the bent spine, and the sketch of the view from the east window. James set the cup in front of her with the expression of a man who knew perfectly well what was wrong with it and was waiting to see what she would do. She wrapped her hands around it. She drank it. "It's terrible," she said. "I know," he said, sitting down across from her. "You have always made it this way. 17 years of practice. That is not something to be proud of." "No," he agreed, "and yet—" She looked at him over the rim of the cup, at the particular way he held his shoulders, at the slight hesitation before he smiled, that specific smile, the one that reached all the way to his eyes and stayed there, the one she had watched him produce in this same light in a different room a lifetime ago and had carried without quite meaning to for every year since. Some things, she thought, were worth waiting for. She had stopped waiting. She had chosen instead. It turned out to be the same thing in the end, just arrived at differently. Through longer roads and harder winters and the slow, particular work of becoming entirely oneself, her mother had known. It is enough. It is, in fact, everything. Outside, the spring continued its ordinary, extraordinary business of arriving. Inside, Cecily drank her terrible tea and said nothing and was, completely and precisely, home. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.